Hello everyone, and today we're going to be taking a look at the burial sites of all of the French monarchs. We're going to be checking them out because this is something I was curious about, and I think a lot of people are unsure about where most of the burial sites are for the kings of France. Now, in this video we're going to be going through every single French king, including the Merovingian kings of the Franks. We're basically going to go all the way back to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. We're starting with Clovis I in 481 AD, going all the way down to the last monarch, Napoleon III, who was taken over during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. So this is going to be very surface level information. I'm just going to be going through the various sites. Some I might have more to say about than others because we have about 90 French kings to go through, and if I spend a minute on each of those, the video is going to be an hour and a half long. So we're going to try to prevent that as much as I can. And I would like to say a little bit of a disclaimer before we get started. My pants are in fact zipped up. So just to let you guys know, for those of you that were wondering, in the last video, the Andrew Johnson gravesite, for those of you guys that saw that, my pants were unzipped and I had antennas. I am fully healed from whatever disease I contracted in that video, and I'm sorry it's been a minute, but we're just going to get started right into this. Let me whip out my laser pointer. As we know, this is Louis XIV, and we'll learn more about them as we get going. Alright, so the very first king we're doing here today is Clovis I. Now, Clovis I, I'm just going to be going through basic information. I'm not going to be talking about their entire life stories of all these kings. We're just going to be going into the basic information here. So this is the gravesite of Clovis I. Now, Clovis I was the very first king of the Franks. Now, his father, Childeric, was ruling an area of the Frankish territory known as the Salian Franks. The Franks were a barbarian tribe just around south of the Nile, or not the Nile, south of the Rhine River Valley. Not the Nile, that's the completely wrong continent. The Rhine River, which is in modern-day Germany. So the Franks took up an area pretty much today that corresponds with France and Germany. And so during the later stages of the Western Roman Empire, the Romans were constantly getting invaded by barbarian tribes, and the Franks were one of them. Now, the Merovingian dynasty is named after Clovis I's grandfather named Merovec, who fought alongside the Romans against the invasion of Attila the Hun earlier on in the 400s in the 5th century. So that's the significance. Not much is known about him, but he was a Frankish commander. So Clovis I was originally part of the Salic Empire and became the first king to rule over all of the Franks. So that's why we're starting with him. Now, he takes the throne in 481 AD, just about 5 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So that's very significant. Now, this is Clovis right here, buried alongside, I believe, one of his sons here. So he's buried at the Saint Denis Basilique, which translates in English to the Saint Denis Basilica. Now, you're going to see this come up very frequently in this video. I would bet that about 80 to 85% of all French kings are buried in that basilica. Now, it's important to know that the Saint Denis Basilica was not built until, I believe, 1135 AD. Wasn't built until the 12th century. So all of these monarchs' graves and bones were moved to the basilica when it was built. I believe Louis VII would have been the first king, or maybe Louis VI. Louis VI would have been the first king to preside over the Saint Denis Basilique, which a lot of French kings are buried there, and that's located in Saint Denis in France. So this is a picture down here of Clovis I, setting the precedent here, and that's what he looks like. So that'd be pretty cool to see. Clovis is an ancient king, man. So next up is Theuderic I. Now, Theuderic I was also a Merovingian, as you can tell. He is not buried at Saint Denis. He is buried at the Abbaye Saint-Pierre Lévis in Sens, France. So after the fall, or after the death of Clovis I, the Frankish Empire was split into pretty much 4 parts. Now, all of these guys ruled over a different city. You had about 4 cities. There was Metz up in the region known as Austrasia, which was part of the original Salian area in Germany, the city of Metz. And then down in Neustria, which was the southern part, pretty much corresponding with France today, you have the cities of Paris, which is Paris, Orléans, and Soissons. So all of these four monarchs end up ruling various parts of those. So this is through Derek the First, who ends up ruling part of Metz, which is in Austrasia. So then you get Theudebert of Metz. Now, not a lot is known about Theudebert the First. All we know is he ruled for about 14 years, and his body has been either lost or destroyed at some point. We're not sure where he's buried. If anybody in the comments knows where Theudebert the First is buried, let us know, because I could not find it. And another common thing was during the French Revolution, there was a big thing to overthrow the monarch, big push. And when Robespierre was presiding over the Committee of Public Safety, they tried to do everything they could to get rid of any monarchical bias within the French culture. So a lot of them ended up in 1793 and 1794 raiding the Basilica and opening up some graves. And some of them were destroyed, of the old kings. Most of them were not. But there were a few, like Louis XV, Louis XIII, some of the later Bourbon monarchs. So Theudebald of Metz succeeded. So I'm just kind of going in the order of each territory. Now, Theudebald, we don't know anything about where he's buried as well. We don't even really have a picture of him. But he was not king for very long. He was also a Merovingian. The Merovingians were the first part of the Frankish kingdom, before it was even an empire. What on earth is going on here? That screwed up. Okay, we're back. So now we have Clodomir of Orleans. So Clodomir died relatively young. He was like 29 when he died. He's buried at Saint Denis, and this is a picture of the actual basilica there in Saint Denis. So I believe what happened after the death of this guy is he had about 3 sons and a guy named Clothar the First, who took over the entirety of the Frankish kingdom again, following Clovis, and the first person to rule all the Franks since Clovis. It is important to note that the Merovingians were indeed a Christian dynasty, which is pretty uncommon for the 400s and pretty early on, because Christianity was definitely not a mainstay yet mostly within European society. It was starting to get there, but definitely not worldwide. Next up is Childebert the First. Des Prés, which is in Paris. So that is an absolutely beautiful building too. I mean, all of these Catholic cathedrals in France are really just breathtaking. But I'm not sure what happened to the tombs, why I don't have pictures of them. I just couldn't find them online. I'm not saying they're not there. I just have to go there and check it out. But a lot of this is just such a long time ago. And Europe at the time, you got to understand, in my opinion, no one can understand the history of Europe or the history of the world without understanding the Roman Empire and the amount of an impact it had. Because it reached its peak early, and it had a slow decline of hundreds of years. And so by the time it did eventually fell, basically human society as a whole, and especially in Europe, pretty much regressed for centuries. And that's why the medieval period is often known as the Dark Ages. And this was just the very beginning of it. Next up is Dagobert of the Franks. Now, he rules for 10 years. Can't do math. He rules for 10 years, and this is where he's buried in the Saint Denis Basilique. So we actually do have a photo there of Dagobert's gravesite, so that's interesting. Next up, we have Sigebert III. Now, Sigebert III presides and governs over the area, rules Austrasia. So you go back to Austrasia, and it's not as much as it was before, with where you had 4 different city-state almost things, like city-state-like-esque cities, territories. You had now Austrasia and Neustria, which were much larger land masses, but still split in different generations. So Sigebert is Austrasia, so he's buried at the Abbey of St. Martin, which is in Nancy, France. So that's where he's buried, and that is a statue picture of Sigebert III. So Childebert the Adopted is next. Now, Childebert is a little bit interesting because the previous monarch of Austrasia, which I believe is where he ruled, actually ended up, because you can see his dynasty here is not Merovingian. It's actually, he's a Pipinid, which was originally at that time In the 600s, there was a position known as the mayor of the palace, which was becoming very popular within the Franks. And so Childebert was, I believe, the son of the mayor of the palace, which the previous monarch, Sigebert III, decided to adopt him as his heir, which was a very common practice in the Roman Empire. A lot of times you would have the emperors, especially during the era of the 5 good emperors, and previously during the Julio-Claudian dynasty and things like that, you had the emperor would adopt a child based on merit rather than just bloodline connection. Although that was a big factor, but since Childebert was born to a prestigious family anyway, being the mayor of the palace, and a lot of the Frankish kings were starting to get scared of that position because the mayor of the palace was actually becoming more powerful than the monarch itself. Childebert was adopted, but he only lived about a year before he died at the age of 7, and he's buried in the church of Saint Stephen in Compiègne. So Clovis II is up of Neustria. So I mentioned that I believe he's buried right next to, I think that's Clovis I. Somebody probably correct us in the comments, but he was a Merovingian, so we go back to the Merovingians now, and he's buried in the Saint Denis Basilica. So there's a picture of him. He was pretty interesting, only ruled over Neustria. So now you get Dagobert II of Austrasia. So now we're going back to Austrasia. I just kind of try to do them in order. He's buried in Saint Denis, and that's a picture of his conquest. I think he died in combat on falling off of a horse or something familiar to that story. So interesting death, and he is placed in this crypt here at the Saint Denis Basilique. So that's definitely the place to visit if you're into grave sites like me. If I ever go to end up in France, I'm going to check out the Saint Denis Basilique. Speaking of the Saint Denis Basilique, we have Clothar III. Now, which is interesting is like history repeated itself within the Franks a lot. All 3 of the Clothars ended up ruling the entire territory and brought them all back together, which is really interesting. So he's buried at Saint Denis. That's Clothar III, 670s. Childeric II is up. Now he's buried at Saint Germain des Prés, which a previous king was also buried there as well. There are a couple monarchs here and there buried there. So that's in Paris. So, pretty interesting place. That would also be probably on the list. So, that's very cool. He looks pretty epic too. Keep in mind too, a lot of these portraits are not original. They are recreations from centuries later. Probably over 1,000 years to be exact, to be precise. So, Theuderic II is Theuderic III, excuse me. He's buried in the Abbey of Saint Vaast in Arras, France. So he's buried in this building, which almost looks kind of like a palace, like a modern day, like Buckingham Palace style thing. And France is a little bit different from a lot of the other European countries in the fact that a lot of the French kings are buried in France. And there's like only 2 that are not buried in France, which a lot of other countries can't even say that because a lot of, especially in Europe, a lot of the kings are buried in other places. And even if they died internationally, they're still buried in France. They took their body back, so that's interesting. So I believe here is the crypt of Theuderic III. So next up you get Clovis IV. Clovis IV is buried in Saint Stephen Aubach, France. So that's the building right there. A lot of these places are probably old. Keep in mind, like I said, a lot of the bones were probably moved because the original burial sites in the 600s most likely are not standing today, and their bones are probably moved at some point following either the collapse of the building or renovation or whatnot happened. But a lot of these Merovingian Frankish kings, that the old Merovingian kings, are not buried in their traditional original location. So Childebert II right here is buried. He died in 711 AD. Pretty good year. That would have been interesting to be alive back then. St. Stephen Church Cemetery, which is the same place, I believe, as Clovis IV. Yes. So he's buried in Choisy-Aubach. So if you ever visit there, you can check out not just Clovis IV, but also Childebert II. So next up, you get Dagobert III. Now, Dagobert III is from 711 to 715 AD. So he's buried at the Basilique in Saint Etienne, which is also in Choisy-Aubach. So it's not too far from the location of his predecessors. Now, this is an older photo, as you can tell. Not sure what year it was taken. Probably sometime around 1900, maybe a couple decades, or a couple decades before, maybe late 1800s, somewhere around there is when I can tell that picture was most likely taken. So Clothar the Fourth is up. So Clothar the Fourth, unlike the other Clothar kings, was actually just king of Austrasia, because by this point, in their own territories of Austrasia and Neustria are starting to become very weak, and the mayor of the palace is about to start to sense a revolt here in the next couple years. Actually, one of them, led by the Carolingian leader Charles Martel, is going to take over the Frankish kingdom for one generation, and then it's going to go back to the Merovingians, and then eventually go back again to the Carolingians and stay there for another couple hundred years. So he's buried at the Wissembourg Abbey in Alsace. Now Alsace is right there. If you go there today, there's an area called Alsace and Lorraine, and I have a bunch of family from that area. I have French blood in me and German blood. So that area was constantly, throughout history, was notoriously fought over by the German and French leaders, whether it be the Holy Roman Empire or West Francia or whatever it is. And he's buried in that region, Alsace. So that's right by Germany. What's interesting to me is how many of their territory did consist of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany, and then parts of some other countries as well, which is surprising that none of them are actually buried there, most likely because of a body removal renovation type thing. But that is a very nice building. Next up is Chilperic II. Now, Chilperic II is the last of the straight line of Merovingians. So he's buried in the Noyon Cathedral, which is in the city of Noyon, France. So a lot of these Merovingian kings are buried in different locations. Once we get to the start of the actual French kingdom, you're going to see a lot more shift to just Saint Denis, because they're going to go back there. But for these, they're buried in different spots. So next up is going to be Theuderic IV. So he was actually the last of the original Merovingians to rule the Franks. So he is actually buried at Saint Denis. So Theuderic IV is there. Theuderic IV was taken over in 737 by the current mayor of the palace named Charles Martel. Now, Charles Martel is pretty famous because he is the grandfather of Charlemagne, one of the most influential figures in medieval history. Charlemagne was, we'll get more into him when we get to him, but he was crowned emperor in the year 800 AD, which making him the first person to ever be crowned emperor since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So, Charles Martel was his grandfather. Now, Charles Martel himself did not rule long. He only ruled for about 4 years, as you can see, 737 to 741. So he is buried in Saint Denis, so that is his grave. That would be a pretty epic one to see, and there's a statue of him. Charles Martel definitely had a lasting impact, although he never really got to live to see it. But he was a great military commander, and the Pope recognized Charles Martel and the mayors of the palace as the actual stadtholders, as they had more power than the monarch. So that shows a real big shift in political and military power within the Frankish kingdom at this time. So next up, you're going to get Childeric III, who is the last of the Merovingian kings. So right after Charles Martel, the Merovingians are able to come back for about 8 years with one king named Childeric III, like I said. So he's buried at the Cimetière Église Saint-Brice in Paris. So no one actually knows where his body is today, unfortunately, like some of the predecessors. But after Childeric III, the Franks changed forever. So next up you get Pepin the Short. Now Pepin the Short, I believe, is one of the oldest monarchs to where you have the Carolingian again. But it's one of the oldest monarchs that when the revolutionists under the Committee of Public Safety, during the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, they did storm the Saint Denis Basilique. In 93, they were able to open up the casket of Pepin the Short to do some damage to it, but I'm pretty sure nothing severe happened, unlike some of the more recent kings of the time, because this is still over 1,000 years before the French Revolution takes place. But Pepin the Short is called Pepin the Short because there were previously the three mayors of the... This is Pepin the Short. His name really should be Pepin the Younger, not Pepin the Short, but that's just what it is, so that's what I'm going to call him that. So in this, the way that I've seen Saint Denis work, and I've never actually been there, so I can't really say this for sure, but it seems like they have a bunch of signs up here, and this is signifying all of the monarchs and just figures, people that are buried in each of the crypts. So this is actually a crypt of a bunch of different monarchs throughout the centuries of France. All the French kings buried in this little crypt here. I'm not too sure how many are in there, but I know it's quite a few. So Carloman I is up. So Carloman I is a Carolingian. Now he's buried in the St. Remy Basilica in Reims. So he is buried not in the traditional place. So he actually rules alongside his brother 3 years, and he only rules for about 3 years. He's the younger brother of Charlemagne. And he's buried in the St. Remy Basilica. And there's multiple French kings buried in this exact crypt here, which you'll see in a minute. So next up we have Charlemagne. So Charlemagne is, like I said, the very first person to be crowned emperor since the fall of Rome, basically, which is a pretty big deal. He was crowned by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day of 800 AD. And so I changed the background, insinuating that the Frankish kingdom is now over, and he creates now what is the Empire of the Franks. And Charlemagne is one of the most powerful figures of medieval history, hands down. I mean, look at that grave. That is literally freaking gold-plated. I mean, it's probably completely made out of gold. I mean, just look at him. There's actually a common theory out there that, fun fact about Charlemagne's crown, that part of the cross that was in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, part of the piece of the cross was actually ingrained in Charlemagne's crown during the ceremony of the coronation, and he wore it during his reign, and he ruled a very long time. I actually have the dates wrong. Charlemagne ruled 768. He ruled alongside his brother Carloman I for a couple years as kind of a joint monarch, but then Charlemagne ends up becoming very powerful, and he ends up ruling more land than anyone will for the next probably 1,000 years, and more than anybody had since the Romans, which is saying something. And some people consider Charlemagne to be the first king of France. Some people consider him to be the first Holy Roman Emperor, because in the numbering system of the Holy Roman Empire and France, he is considered to be Charles I. And the name Charlemagne in French literally means Charles the Great. So he's buried in the Aachen Cathedral in Germany. So he's actually the first and one of only 2 French kings that are buried, or not, there's more than that actually, but in the next, since the post-revolution, I believe there's a couple buried in Slovenia that are not buried in France. He's one of the few that's not buried in France. He's actually buried in Germany. And I believe also at the Aachen Cathedral you have the graves of, I think, Otto III of the Holy Roman Empire, so that's pretty interesting too. He was a Carolingian, Charlemagne was. Next up is Louis the Pious. Now, Louis the Pious doesn't get a lot of credit. Louis the Pious rules pretty much all the land owned by Charlemagne. Now, Charlemagne lives quite a long time, and he has a lot of kids. He has like 3 or 4 sons, but the only son that actually outlives him is Louis the Pious. Now, Louis the Pious is known as Louis the First, so that's pretty significant as how many King Louis France had, and you'll see 19 of them. This was the first of all 19, so he ends up being the last person to rule over the Frankish Empire, because upon Louis the Pious's death, they pass the Treaty of Verdun is signed, splitting the kingdom of the Franks amongst his 3 sons, creating East Francia, West Francia, and Middle Francia. His eldest son, Lothair, gets the title of emperor in Middle Francia, and then his other son, Louis the German, becomes the king of East Francia, and then his other son becomes the king of West Francia. Now, West Francia eventually evolves into France, East Francia evolves into the Holy Roman Empire, and Middle Francia kind of just fizzles itself out and is kind of in the area of what is today Italy, but pretty much Germany as well. So he's buried, Louis the Pious, started getting ahead of myself there. Louis the Pious is buried in the Abbaye de Saint Arnaud in Metz. So he's buried more up north in the area previously of Austrasia. So now you get the creation of West Francia under the Treaty of Verdun, passed by Louis the Pious upon his death. So his son, Charles the Bald, inherits the throne of West Francia. Now, he's buried in Saint Denis, and he's a Carolingian. All of them are Carolingians, but the Middle Francia only lasts a couple generations. So Charles the Bald is buried right here in the Saint Denis Basilique, and here's another picture of him. So Charles the Bald was not actually bald. I'm not sure why his name is that. Apparently he was actually quite hairy. So the name really makes no sense. And yeah, I've always been confused that, but it is kind of a cool name. So regardless of that, but Charles the Bald was not actually bald, but he was the first king of West Francia, which eventually would evolve into France. So he's a pretty influential guy. Next up is Louis the Stammerer. Louis the Stammerer is more commonly known as Louis II. Well, he's actually more commonly known as Louis the Stammerer, but he's also known as Louis II. Only ruled about 2 years. He's buried, I believe, in this little casket here, and it's this box, whatever this is. It looks like it's made out of gold as well. He's buried in the Cormile Abbey in Cormile, France, so that's pretty interesting there. After Louis the Stammerer dies, 3 of his sons end up becoming king, and 2 of them ruled together for a few years, Louis III and Carloman II. As you can see, they're both buried here. This is Louis III, and I think it says Carloman back here. And then this is Carloman. So look, Carloman, Louis III, Carloman II. So there they are. They're both buried at Saint Denis. So Louis III and Carloman II rule until 882 jointly, and then Carloman II outlives his older brother by a couple of years, and so he dies in 884. Before the entire kingdom is subsumed again by Charles the Fat. Now, Charles the Fat is, at the time, king of East Francia, and so he ends up conquering West Francia after the fall of Middle Francia. So West Francia gets conquered by Charles the Fat, and Charles the Fat ends up kind of ruling and becomes the last person to rule over all of the Franks, and will be the last person to rule over all the Franks for the rest of history. And so, as you can see, he only rules for about 4 years because he dies in 888. Now, he's buried in Reichenau in Germany at Friedhof Mittelzell. So Friedhof basically translates to cemetery in German. So as you can see, he was an imperator, which means emperor. That's what the Romans called emperors. Princeps Civitatis, imperator. That's the title that was given to Augustus. So he died in 1888, or 888. Man, I cannot talk. 888. He was a Carolingian, but from a completely different branch of the family. So Charles the Fat comes in and takes over after the death of Carloman II because their younger brother, Charles the Simple, is about 9 years old, too young to take the throne, so Charles the Fat takes advantage of that and becomes king. After he dies, Charles the Simple is still too young to rule. He's about 9 years old, so they actually elect a guy from the Robertian dynasty named Odo of Paris, or Eudes. And so he ends up ruling for about 10 years. He's a Robertian, which is a very short-lived dynasty in West Francia. So he is buried at the Saint Denis Basilique, but no one actually knows where his crypt is, which kind of stinks. Odo actually ends up dying. Charles the Simple pretty much presides as the last male line descendant of Charlemagne, one of the last male line Carolingians. Is his branch actually continued for 3 more generations upon his death. So he rules from 898 to 922. That is a very prestigious burial site. I mean, that looks like it's made out of complete gold. He's buried at the Abbey of Saint Fursy in Péronne. So that's kind of interesting. Charles the Simple, right there. He was a son of Louis the Stammerer. So then you get Robert I. The Robertians come back for a couple of years. He's buried in the Abbey de Saint Colombe de Sens in Sens, France. So once he died, and as you can see with the question mark, that his tomb has not been found. So then I believe his daughter's son, his son-in-law, ends up succeeding him as Rudolph, or known in French as Raoul de la Mine. So he ends up ruling for 13 years, 923 to 936. No one can locate his grave, but he's supposedly buried the same place as Robert I. And I'm not sure the ordeal with the Abbey of St. Colombe, and it's possible that it could have been destroyed somewhere over the millennia. Hard to say for sure. Rudolph himself is considered to be a Robertian, but he was actually part of the House of Burgundy. Now, the Kingdom of Burgundy, which is in Italy, was actually conquered by Charlemagne about 200 years before. 100 years before, so 150 years probably before. And so he ends up ruling, but he's the last Burgundy monarch because after Rudolph dies, the kingdom is taken back over by the Carolingians with Louis IV, who is the son of previously mentioned Charles the Simple. Now, Louis IV was only about 16 years old when he became king. Now, you can see he's buried in this crypt, and that is, I believe, the same crypt as Carloman II, or the Carloman I. So Louis IV is also buried in there. And he died in 954. definitely. That'd be another one to check out for sure. Next up is Lothair. Now Lothair actually has a pretty solid reign, and he's seen as a very pious monarch and a very just overall good ruler. Now he's the last total good Carolingian monarch, because after him the Carolingians kind of start to fall apart. Now this is the last surviving branch male line of Charlemagne, which is pretty significant. He's also buried in that same crypt as his father Louis IV, and he's known as Lothair of West Francia. So he's buried in Reims at the Saint Remy Basilica. Louis V, it is unknown where he's buried. Louis V was the last king of the Carolingians, and he's known as Louis the Do-Nothing, because he didn't do a lot to prevent the invasion of the Capetians, led by Hugh Capet, who was the son of Hugh the Great, a very prominent leader during the Robertian era. Now, Louis V, he's buried in Compiègne Abbey in Compiègne, France, but no one actually knows where he actually presides his bones today. So next up you get Hugh Capet. Now keep in mind, Hugh Capet is where some people like to start as well. Hugh Capet brings his body back to Saint Denis. Well, I guess other people bring his body. I don't think he's bringing his own body. But he starts back the old tradition. And pretty much since Hugh Capet, just about every single French monarch has been buried in Saint Denis, with just a few exceptions. Now keep in mind that the kingdom is still West Francia at this time, and it doesn't become the kingdom of France until I believe the reign of Philippe II. So we're getting there. So now we have the House of Capet. Now if you don't count junior branches and dukedoms, the House of Capet is the longest reigning royal dynasty in European history, because the House of Capet in itself, the male line actually lasted all the way until the French Revolution, which is pretty insane. However, you do get the other dukedoms that eventually take over. That's why you get the dynasties of Valois and Bourbon later on, which we'll talk about. So he's buried in Saint Denis. So next up we have Robert II. Robert II is king during the turn of the millennium, 996 to 1031 AD. He's buried in Saint Denis as well, and has a pretty detailed grave there. So what's really interesting about all these medieval monarchs is and even today, I think Queen Elizabeth II is buried just like this, where they have the grave carved out for him, and they'll be doing like this pose, and it's literally carved out to fit their racial structure. And I've only seen that at one place I've ever been to, in the Washington Cathedral in Washington, D.C. They had that for a couple of the bishops, a couple of the religious leaders within the cathedral. But it's very rare, and it's only really used for noble prominence. But noble prominence. But it's very interesting to see, and I would love to see more of it in person. So he's buried at Saint Denis. Henri I is up. Shout outs to Alamy. Just so you guys know, I don't own the rights to any of these pictures, but there they are. Now he is buried at Saint Denis as well there. So he's buried alongside another one of his co-kings there. Not obviously during his reign, but another one of his fellow French kings. So Philippe I is next. He's buried at the Abbey of Saint Benoit-sur-Loire. So he's one of the couple exceptions that aren't buried at Saint Denis. And so he's buried here. That's a really interesting pattern on the floor there. I mean, when you go into these Catholic monasteries, basilicas in these European countries, it's absolutely breathtaking. Hopefully you guys get to see these at some point if you're interested. So Philippe I is there. So what's interesting is throughout, so Louis VI is buried alongside Henri I. So you have Henri I and Louis VI. During the raid during the French Revolution, Louis VI's grave was also taken out of the casket for harmful reason. Which I'm not sure why exactly they attacked Louis VI, but I digress, whatever. Louis VI is significant because he is actually probably the first, and actually no, definitely is the first monarch of France that was actually laid to rest in the current basilica upon his death, because the basilica was finished in 1135. He died in 1137. So all of the previous monarchs that you see buried in Saint Denis, they were all moved there. So Louis VI is there, and next up you get Louis VII. Now Louis VII, obviously he's buried, I guess, by himself, but And what's interesting is his first wife was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was one of the most powerful women in medieval history. She married Henry II of England and actually had kids with him. Never had any kids with the French king, but she's the only woman in history to be both the Queen of England and the Queen of England and the Queen of France. Although Queen Consort, obviously not a Queen Regnant. You can't have a Queen Regnant in France. So you get a bunch of father-son successions in a row, all the way from Hugh Capet all the way down to the start of the 100 Years' War, making for very healthy reigns. You can see all of these kings end up ruling for 30, 40 years each, which definitely helps for stability within the monarchy. So he is buried in Saint Denis, Louis VII. Next up is Philippe II. Now, Philippe II is the first true king of France, and he's known as Philip the God-given. And so that just insinuates how much of an impact he had on the French people, and he was very beloved for centuries after his death. So he's buried in Saint Denis, as you can see here, Auguste. And this is just a list of all of these guys buried in this crypt. So you can see Dagobert, Charles II, who is Charles the Bald, Philippe II, Louis VIII, Philippe IV, Louis X, Jean I, and so on and so forth, Philippe V, Charles IV, Philippe VI. They're all buried in this one area within the place. So Louis VIII, not too sure where his body's at, but he's known as Louis the Lion, and he participated in a lot of the Crusades. He was one of those Crusader kings of the 1200s. And I believe it was the Third Crusade he helped out in. He was actually declared King of England upon the death of King John. However, he only ruled really for a couple months and was never officially crowned before Henry III could take him over. He's buried at Saint Denis, only ended up ruling for about 3 years, which gave his son the segue of becoming one of the most impactful kings in French history, Saint Louis IX. He's one of the few French kings, and actually the only since Charlemagne, that was actually declared sainthood as a saint. And if you've ever familiar with the city, if you're American watching this, you're familiar with the city, St. Louis, Missouri, that is named after Louis IX. So he rules from 1226 to 1270, a very long reign of a total of about 44 years, which is absolutely pretty impressive for a medieval ruler. So he's buried at Saint Denis right here with a cross, obviously, as he is a saint, which means he also has a feast day and everything that comes with being a saint. Very cool, though. Very cool. Next up is Philippe III. Philippe III was also tampered with during the French Revolution, and a lot of people don't know what happened to a lot of his bones, but most of them were rediscovered after they were scattered and torturized and sabotaged, whatever you want to call it. He's buried right here alongside one of his fellow kings. He was in the Saint Denis Basilica. That was the first place that Robespierre sent his revolutionists to wreak havoc with the past monarchs, to erase any memory of them, which was going to be very hard to do. During the Reign of Terror, I just got to say this, during the Reign of Terror, Maximilian Robespierre needs to be re-examined. I might do a video on this at some time. But the Reign of Terror ended up killing thousands, and I think up to 40,000 people. I mean, I think 2,400 people alone within 1 month in Paris lost their head. If you even associated yourself with any revolutionist policy or anything that they didn't like if you simply wrote in your diary, "I miss the king," or something like that, you were going to get executed, and pretty much your entire family would get executed. So if I was living at that time and I had any sort of opposition to Robespierre or anything, which could easily change in the next 2 weeks, the ideals. If I don't agree with what's going on at that time, me, my wife, and kids, my entire family could get executed due to one simple note or any sort of affiliation. So it was a bad time, and a lot of the old medieval monarchical grave sites were tampered with and sabotaged, but some of them survived. Most of them did, fortunately. They found the bones of a lot of them, but not all. So he's buried in Saint Denis. There's Philippe IV. So next up you get Louis X. Now Louis X, pretty tragic story. So he dies in his 20s. He's buried at Saint Denis. Now his wife was actually pregnant when Louis X died. Louis X died without a son. There's him close up. It definitely looks like the man. So Louis X was pretty much the last of the father-son succession that had been going on since Hugh Capet for the last 200 plus years. His wife is about 5 months from having a child. She has the child, And it is a boy. And in France, you have to be male to inherit the throne. So if that child would have been a daughter, would not have inherited. However, Jean I rules in the womb for about 5 months, but only lives 5 days. And so that's why you see a baby here. But he is considered to be Jean I in the numbering of the monarchs, and did end up becoming a king. So he rules in November of 1316. And could you just imagine being one of Louis X's brothers, and you almost become king, and then out of nowhere your unborn nephew and a baby becomes king, and you don't. Fortunately, though, for him, Joel I did not live long, so he is kind of a legend. As you can see, he's buried right there. And poor guy, who knows what he could have done, but he only lived 5 days, which was pretty common for medieval babies, because a lot of times when monarchs had kids, they had a lot of them, and the queen often had to try many times. This was just one of those incidents where this guy ended up ruling from the womb. It was pretty much king upon birth, which is very rare. However, short-lived, because of most, just if there were any problems at birth in the 1300s, there's not much people could do. Us living today, even if you're not a doctor, are smarter than any physicist of the time, even the last couple hundred years. I mean, medical care has come so far since the Middle Ages. It's absolutely insane. And so basically, if a baby was born with any sort of defect, or if there was any complication with the birth, childbirth deaths were very common back then, and that's just kind of the way it was. And Joel I was very unfortunate to only have lived 5 days, although he was king, but never really realized it. Next up is Philippe V. So Philippe V is also a Capet, so he's the first of the non-father-son successions, because Joel I finally made it a little bit interesting. So Philippe V is his uncle, the younger brother of Louis X back here. So Louis X is buried in Saint Denis. Philippe V is also buried in Saint Denis. And so this is the gravesite here of Philippe V and Charles IV, as well as, I believe, one of their wives, or something of that nature. So he's buried in Saint Denis. Charles IV is as well. Charles IV is the last of the mainline Capetians, because after he dies in the year 1328, if you watch the French monarch song, 1328, Philippe VI, the House of Valois. We start to get the House of Valois. So the 100 Years' War begins with the death of Charles IV in 1328, because France follows Salic law, which is a German precedent that had been going back many generations. It basically stated that it was pretty much continentally known at the time that females weren't allowed to inherit the throne. But there was a dispute on whether that male, because it had to be a male to inherit the throne, but there was a dispute on if that male had to come from a strict male-only line, or if a male from a female branch could be allowed. And so the sister of Charles IV, Philippe V, and Louis X marries Edward II of England, Isabel of France, who later cheats on him and has him deposed. It's a long story I'm not going to go into, but that's what happens. And so she has a son named Edward, who is Edward III, and King of England. And so Edward III, all the way up to the time of George III and the creation of Great Britain, all the way through the creation of the UK, claimed to be the kings of France, and fought a war that lasted 116 years, which was the 100 Years' War, which France did end up winning the war, barely at the end. And so, well, I wouldn't say barely, but they did end up winning the war. Now, it wasn't like warfare for 100 years exactly. There was like different uprisings that took place over an 116-year period for the fight for the French throne. So most people in France and the French nobles did not want England inheriting the French throne, and they wanted to stick with Salic law. So they ended up going to a brother of Louis, Philippe IV, one of his brothers, who was a duke. I think he was the Count of Valois. He was Charles the Count of Valois, although he was dead at the time. So it ended up going to his son, Philippe VI, who actually becomes the King of France. So the war starts in 1328 between Edward III and Philippe VI, and will go on all the way until the 1450s, which is absolutely it's a long freaking war. So now the House of Valois is fully in swing, but keep in mind, as far as the male line goes, They're still male line descendants of Hugh Capet, therefore they are part of the Capetian dynasty still. They're just part of the Valois branch, so they're considered their own house, the House of Valois. So Jean II is in there until 1364. Now he's part of the same generation as Jean I, and he's buried at Saint Denis. Now he actually died in England, I believe, as a prisoner during the 100 Years' War, but they did move his body back to France. Charles V is up, so now we're starting to get some more interesting monarchs. So he died in 1338. He's buried in Saint Denis. Charles V's tomb was also sabotaged during the French Revolution by the revolutionists. So next up you get the legend himself, Charles VI. They're also known as Charles the Mad. So Charles the Mad is absolutely insane. This guy, I'm just going to hit the highlights. If you don't know anything about him, he basically almost lost the entire 100 Years' War. He attacked his own men on the battlefield. He refused to believe that he was even the monarch. He had severe mental disorder, and he often would attack his own servants. He'd throw couches at them. And he was so convinced that he was made out of glass that he instructed his servants to put iron ores in his clothes. That way when he walked outside, he wouldn't melt, even though when you walk outside, glass doesn't melt. But he was so afraid of the sun that he thought he was going to melt. And he completely disowned his own son and pretty much gave his entire throne up to the King of England. Although by the time he actually died in October of 1422, the King of England at the time, there was an agreement put in place to make Henry V of England the King of France. But Henry V ends up dying of dysentery at the end of August of 1422. And so Charles VI dies in October, and by the time Charles VI dies, a 9-month-old kid, Henry VI, baby, basically, is on the throne, and so Charles VII, Charles VI's son, ends up inheriting the throne anyway of France, as he knew he was his son, but Charles VI never was convinced that he was actually the King of France, and never was convinced that Charles VII was his son. He was going to do anything to prevent him from getting the throne. Basically, Charles VI was a complete madman. If you want to hear more details on that, let me know down in the comments, and I'll be glad to talk to you about it, because he was probably arguably the worst king in human history. So next up is Charles VII. So he's buried in Saint Denis as well, part of the House of Valois. He was born in 1403. So here's just a couple other tombs in the area. Now next up is Louis XI. Louis XI and his son Charles VIII are a little bit different for whatever reason. They were not buried in Saint Denis. They were actually buried in the Basilique Notre Dame in Saint Andre, Clary Saint Andre. And this is a photo, actually, very interesting, when Louis XI's body was exhumed. So here is Louis XI's skull down there. So that's actually kind of interesting. Louis XI died in the Chateau de Plessis-les-Tours, which is pretty interesting there. That was the name of his palace, and I don't know why that was important to say, but I love the name of that palace, the Chateau de Plessis-les-Tours. That is an amazing name for a palace, I just have to say. So he died in 1483. Pretty interesting burial there. So in the same place, the Basilique in Notre Dame in Clary Saint Andre, Charles VIII is also buried there, who died in 1498. And so after Charles VIII dies, throne passes to Louis XII, and Louis XII is restored at Saint Denis and is buried there. Pretty awesome looking grave there for Louis XII. So next up is Francois I. Now Francois I, Louis XII is not really related too much closely to Charles VIII. He's like a distant cousin, like a first cousin twice removed or something like that. So pretty interesting there. And then he's succeeded by another cousin who becomes Francois I. Now, Francois I actually had a wrestling match with Henry VIII during the some sort of medieval games contest, sort of like the Olympics, but it wasn't the Olympics. It was like a yearly festival thing, every couple of years, maybe something like that, maybe a biannual thing. I don't know what it was, but they had a wrestling match, which is interesting. And I think Henry VIII won that. I think that was around 1520. So that's kind of interesting. But Francois I is pretty influential. A lot of people know him. He's buried in Saint Denis. Not going to get into all the things that he did, because he did a lot, but for France, and it was very important. But he's buried at Saint Denis, just like a lot of his predecessors and successors. So Henri II is up. Now Henri II is one of those guys. He dies pretty tragically young at the age of 40. leaving his young sons as kings, and all three of his sons end up becoming king, and then it leads to the end of the Valois dynasty. So he's buried in Saint Denis right there. So after Henri II dies, you get Francois II. Now, Francois II, at the time of his death, was actually married to Mary, Queen of Scots, which is actually interesting. She was the Queen of Scotland, and actually, interesting alternate history. Had Francois II and Mary, Queen of Scots, actually had a child, maybe there would have been an alliance between and a union between France and Scotland, which would have been an interesting little twist in history. But alas, Francois II dies at age 16 in 1560 and only rules for about a year. And he's buried at Saint Denis. And he was succeeded by two of his sons. The first one was Charles IX, who I believe his grave was destroyed during the French Revolution at Saint Denis. And then also Henri III. Now, Henri III himself was assassinated because Francois II, Charles IX, and Henri III all died without sons. And so he is assassinated in 1589 during the wars, the French wars of religion. And so, because he kind of converts to Protestantism, which was very unprecedented in France, because France forever, going all the way back to the Merovingian Franks, was Roman Catholic. So that was really interesting. But he is buried in the Saint Denis Basilique. And then same can be said about Henri I. He was strongly Protestant. And during Henri IV's reign, 1589 to 1610, a revolt happens known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which eventually led to Henri IV's assassination. Now, Henri IV is part of the House of Bourbon. Henri IV is a ninth cousin of Henri III. Due to France's strict rule of inheritance, there were no male lines closer from the Valois dynasty. Basically what happened was they had to go all the way back to the Count of Clermont, who was the younger brother of Louis IX. And I'm just going to show you where Louis IX is. You had to go all the way back to Louis IX's younger brother, who was the Count of Clermont. And eventually going through all the male line descendants, the most senior was the Bourbons, which was a duke, the dukedom of Bourbon. So Henri IV ends up becoming the monarch after the assassination of Henri III. Now, none of the late Valois kings were very old when they died. So Henri IV ends up getting assassinated himself, and his tomb was placed in Saint Denis. They tried to destroy his tomb during the French Revolution, as they absolutely despised the Bourbons. Luckily, it did not become completely destroyed. Unlike his son, Louis XIII. Now, Louis XIII, very controversial, because he was the guy who made France an absolute monarchy, which was absolutely, he was an autocrat, and he ruled in the 1600s, from 1610 to 1643, increasing the power of the monarch. Now, fun fact about powdered wigs, as you can tell, like in the 1700s and even early 1800s, a lot of people in history, prominent figures, wore powdered wigs. Louis XIII, supposedly by legend, started the trend because he was going bald, and so he decided to implement a powdered wig, and that's kind of where the whole thing started. But his grave was absolutely sabotaged during the French Revolution, due to the fact that he was the one who founded the absolute monarch and created everything that the revolutionists and the what was that group called? The Jacobins were against. Now, his son Louis XIV was even greater. He's known as the Sun King. Louis XIV was on the throne for 72 years, the longest of any European monarch in history. He was very powerful. He created the Palace of Versailles, which was the last place of residence of the French monarchs. And he lived so long that he ended up outliving his son and his grandson. He was succeeded by his great-grandson, Louis XV. Now, Louis XIV won many major victories and was probably the most powerful king in European history. He ruled longer than Queen Elizabeth II, which is crazy. 1643 to 1715. That's just absolutely insane. And his grave still stands there in Saint Denis, but there was a big push to destroy it. And it's very fortunate that the people of France did not destroy that. Now, Louis XIV was an interesting character. I don't know why I bring this up, but he loved anything of wealth, and so did his mistresses. There's this documentary that I watched. It was like 45 minutes long about just Louis XIV's mistresses, and it was pretty interesting. He was an interesting guy, I'll tell you that. But yeah, he definitely loved his women. He definitely loved his nice things, but he was a very powerful figure, and you didn't mess with Louis XIV, I'm telling you. But he ended up living 72 years, outlived his son and his grandson, and so his great-grandson becomes King Louis XV. He rules for 59 years, so you have two. So basically, you have over a century with just two kings in France. So Louis XV was originally placed in Saint Denis, but when they raided it in late 1793, in the fall of 1793, during the Committee of Public Safety, ordered by Maximilien Robespierre to get rid of all of the monarchical remembrance, they destroyed Louis XV's grave, which kind of sucks because Louis XV's his crown still exists, and you can actually visit that, and it looks pretty. And so, whether or not they destroy the bones or just stole them, it's unknown. We don't know where they are. So 1710. So the stage was set for the French Revolution. Louis XV lost the 7 Years' War previously, and trust in the monarch started to decline. So then you get Louis XVI. Now this is a picture of the exhumation of his head. Louis XVI was famously executed during the French Revolution, lost his head by the guillotine, and so that's pretty sad. And so this is a remembrance right here. They did bring his body back. They didn't destroy it, though there was a big effort too. But this is, I believe, just a memorial to commemorate it. Him and his wife, Marie Antoinette. So Louis XVI had the very unfortunate luck of ruling during the French Revolution. Now, he was actually kind of a decent king. He cared a lot about the people, but he did not like public life at all. And he really didn't want much to do with the French citizens. But unfortunately, just the power of revolution at the time and the growing tensions, he ended up losing his head after attempting to flee the country right before his execution in January of 1793. So that's it for the revolution. Now you get some of the de facto, or also known as disputed, monarchs, and I just decided to throw their burial sites in here because none of these guys are real true kings much. This is Louis XVII. This was Louis XVI's son that actually died in prison at the age of 10. And there were a lot of people that came along saying that they were Louis XVII, but there was DNA tests to further prove that Louis XVII was the child that died in prison during the French Revolution. He's buried at Saint Denis in this little crypt here. His bones are spread in there. Next up is Napoleon. So after the Reign of Terror, you get what's known as the Directory, which is pretty much a flop, and it was led by a group called the bourgeoisie, who was basically the upper middle class. If you think of today as like our business owners of the middle class, the very upper middle class. They weren't nobles, but they were not poor. And so 4 men led the Directory. It was an absolute fail because they only cared about their own strong business. They didn't care actually about the moral rights of the people. So Napoleon comes in, takes over the entire empire. He crowns himself emperor, which is pretty crazy because he thought that he was the highest power in the land. He didn't want the Pope to crown him. So he first takes over in 1799. And about the year 1812, his empire reaches its peak, and he ends up ruling more land than anybody since Charlemagne. Basically being the heir to Augustus is what he thought he was. But he was a great military commander, and everybody loved him. And he issued a lot of reforms in France that were very good. That the last decade, since 1789, was a complete nightmare if you lived in France. The law and order was so corrupt and so it was basically an anarchy at the end of the day. But he's buried in the Dôme des Invalides in Paris. So very interesting at the time of his death. He died in 1821 because he was put in exile twice in 1814. He was relatively decently young when he died. I think he was about 51. But that's his body was moved back to Paris after he died. And he ruled pretty much all of Western Europe and had many allies before he decided to invade Russia in the winter. And if you know anything about taking over the world, do not invade Russia in the winter. Hitler did the same thing and lost. And Napoleon did the same thing. So maybe someday somebody will finally learn. Napoleon II, which actually kind of ruled for 2 weeks, but not really. He's buried at the same place. This was Napoleon's son. Now keep in mind, he ruled in 1814. As you can see, he was born in 1811. So he was kind of like a 3-year-old emperor. So that's why people kind of confused why you get Napoleon and then you get Napoleon III, because Napoleon II ruled for 2 weeks and he's buried in the same place as his father. So he was a Bonaparte. So after the Bonapartists come over, France decides to restore the Bourbons. After everything that happens, they decided to bring the monarch back. So you get Louis XVIII, the younger brother of Louis XIV, or Louis XVI. Like I said, Louis XVII died in France, or died during the Revolution as a 10-year-old child, so that's why the numeration went to the 18th. So he's buried in Saint Denis, brought back the old tradition, ruler of France and Navarre. Now, Navarre was the kingdom down toward the Iberian Peninsula in current-day Spain that the French kings had occupation over pretty much since the 1200s. I think Philippe IV might have been the first king, or Louis X, somewhere around there, to actually rule all that. So next up you get Charles X, because Louis XVIII has no kids when he dies. And Charles X becomes king for about 6 years. He's buried in the Church of St. Mary of the Annunciation. So he's actually buried in Nova Gorica in Slovenia. So he's not buried in France, which is pretty interesting. So you can see here CX, Charles X, and then you get to a couple disputed kings. So you get Louis XIX here, he's buried in Slovenia, and so is Henri V. So these two guys are pretty interesting because they're not even really recognized monarchs, although it does say it on their gravestones, which is amazing. So what happens is in 1830, another revolution happens, crowning a guy named Louis Philippe as king, as a very liberal king. He had to follow a constitution, not absolutist. It was not an autocracy anymore like it had previously been. So Charles X abdicates the throne. But allegedly, for 20 minutes before his son also abdicates, Louis XIX rules France for 20 minutes, becoming the shortest reigning monarch in history. Ruling for 20 minutes in 1830. And what's amazing is on his grave it says Louis XIX, which is absolutely amazing, and I love that. So next up you get Henri V. Henri V rules for about 5 months, I think, before they really solidify Louis XIV and the House of Orleans is in. And all these guys were still Bourbons. It also says Henri V on it. But he served as a prominent politician outside of the monarch during the Third Republic and things like that, during the Empire, Napoleon III, before, during Louis Philippe's regime. So that's pretty interesting. So he's buried in Slovenia. So what's really cool is it has Charles X, Louis XIX, and Henri V, even though they're disputed kings. So now you have Louis Philippe I. So he's part of the House of Orleans, which is still part of the House of Capet. It's still male line descent, and it's just one of a different branch. Because all the Bourbons were pretty much dead by that point. At least this is the most senior branches. The House of Bourbon still rules today in Spain, which is kind of interesting, due to the War of the Spanish Succession that happened back in the 1700s. So he's buried in the Chapel Royale de Dreux, which is in France, in Dreux. So this is where he's buried in there. And the House of Bourbon is about to come to an end because, fun fact, the current king of Spain, Felipe VI, his daughter, will be the last monarch from the House of Bourbon, because whoever she marries, she will take on that royal house name. Napoleon III was the very last monarch to rule over France, and his empire was not as powerful as Napoleon's. It was pretty much as long-lived, for about a decade and a half, but he was eventually put out with the Franco-Prussian War, and after that, Prussia proved as a dominative power in Europe and formed the German Empire, and so Napoleon III ends up abdicating and dies a couple years later. He's buried in St. Michael's Abbey in Farnborough in England, so he's actually buried in Britain, so that's interesting. So that actually concludes all of the burial sites of all the French kings. Let me know if you found this video interesting, if you'd like to see me do this on more. I'm sorry that was so long, but there's a lot of kings of France, and I wanted to make sure I got them all. So with that all said and done, thank you guys for watching. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe, and hopefully I'll be able to visit these at some point, and I'll do videos on them and things like that. So thank you guys for watching. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. Wow.